If you haven't listened to our previous episode, number 43, go ahead and listen to it before this one, which is a continuation of that conversation. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and I'm here with Molly Stevens, Kristin Donnelly, and Andrea and Molly. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Kate.
Hey, Kate.
Last week, we had a lot of fun getting into some of the big picture things that we had to learn about as we went in writing books, like everything from what an advance is, what are royalties, how much money do we get, like when do we get the money? But I thought this week we could go a little bit deeper into some of the nitty gritty behind the money. For instance, one of the big expenses when writing a book are groceries, and how you keep track of all that stuff really makes a difference, especially when it's tax season. Just wanted to start off, how big of a percentage of the budget are groceries? I mean, Kristin, you have this beautiful pie chart on your website that shows where all the expenses lie. So with groceries, what percentage is it from your advance?
That's funny. What did I say?
10%.
10% was what I estimated out of $60,000. So that's about $6,000 for 100 recipes. But it was also many years ago before groceries were so darn expensive. So it probably costs more now.
Depends on what you're testing too. I mean, Molly, you wrote books on like roasting and braising meat's pricey.
Yeah, I went back in preparation for this conversation and I actually added up some numbers. I came up with I spent about $60 to $70 per recipe on recipe development.
Wow.
And for the roasting book, it's higher. It was closer to 80. And now, again, that goes back to what I said at the top about how slow I am and how many times I test to make these recipes. And not just test them, but like develop them over and over again. But yeah, if you're doing, there was a lot of meat in these books. And so I'm buying pork roasts and whole chickens and fish. And yeah, so it's important to think about what the ingredients are. And I think it's implicit in this conversation that we are deducting in our personal income taxes. I call them supplies, is what my tax preparation person categorize them at. But, we keep track of these receipts and add them all up at the end of the year so you can deduct them as a business expense.
My accountant uses cost of goods sold for my groceries.
Oh,
which I
really?
think is kind of funny. Yeah.
Yeah, I do supplies.
I do supplies.
But what do you guys do when it's a collaboration, Kate and Kristin?
It depends on, because I don't test for every single book that I work on, but anything in the kitchen that's related, I certainly deduct. Or sometimes I might not be officially testing a recipe, but I might try out something or just to get an idea of how a certain technique works. Anything that's related, I deduct.
For me, it really depends on the project. I'll give you an example. When I worked on Cookie Love with Mindy Siegel, we estimated, and of course this is 2015, so think of that when you're thinking of food cost. I think it was $2,000 we estimated for ingredient cost. I think we ended up lower. But again, that's a baking book. The most expensive costs were butter and eggs, which were cheaper back then. But what I would do is I would go to the grocery store, buy those groceries, keep those receipts, scan them, and then I would invoice the restaurant to pay me back because I was developing and testing. It was part of my agreement with the author that I would be reimbursed up to $2,000 or whatever the agreement was.
Got it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's funny. Even though I have to do it for taxes, I hate invoicing for ingredients, just the tedium of it. So I also will sometimes negotiate a flat fee or just keep that in mind when I'm negotiating some piece of it and just try to include ingredients as part of the whole thing. And then I just write it all off at the end.
It is true. It does add to time. It adds to your paper trail. I mean, I was doing recipe development for a food brand, and it was a big chunk of time was spent, scanning those receipts and keeping track of all that. So if you are making your own book and you're the sole author, you really should also factor in just the accounting part of managing your project. And that's something that I definitely have underestimated in the past and probably continue to do so. I mean, Andrea, what do you do? How do you keep track of your receipts?
Good Lord. Now I have to tell you, I have this drawer.
A magic drawer of receipts.
I have a magic receipt drawer in my kitchen. I keep large clips around and I sandwich them.
Like binder clips?
Binder clips, the things that we use a lot in publishing because we have so much paper to keep together. But yeah, I do it that way and I'll add things up mark receipts and stuff like that. There is like some kind of percentage. I mean, I come up with some kind of percentage. It depends on whether I'm not working on a book. But yeah, you got to keep track of those receipts. But the cool thing is that it's all food that you're going to eat, hopefully.
Right.
If you like what you're making.
I sometimes joke that my life is just one big receipt management system, because if I go to the grocery store and I'm working on a project, if it's, say it's a magazine article and I'm getting reimbursed, then I want to keep those receipts clean. You know, I'm the lady in the checkout line is like, okay, this order is this. And I'm like, no, I'm paying for them all, but this has to be separate from this. And so the recipe development for the magazine article will be very separate, because I don't want them to also see that I bought, 6 bottles of 2-buck chuck and no.
A case of beer.
Yeah, exactly. So
unless it was for a recipe.
Yeah. So they stay very clean, and they go in a separate place where I get invoiced. And I can't deduct those from my taxes because I got reimbursed for them. And then if I'm working on recipes for my own projects, there is the question of, okay, I bought light bulbs and toothpaste on that. Do I, then mark up the receipt when I get home, or do I separate that out? Those are questions you can ask yourself. I'm not going to get into that. But actually, I did look again at some numbers, and my ingredient supply over a period of about 10 years one was like $1,300, and then the highest one must have been when I was doing the roasting book was as much as $4,500 in a year on ingredients.
Yeah.
However that breaks down. So it's it's a lot of money.
It's a lot.
After I think one tax season of going through that receipt drawer all at once, I said never again. So what I do is, as the receipts pile up, I take, once a week, a couple times a month, I have a folder and I put them in the folder, and then I write on the folder the actual numbers. So then when it comes tax time, I just have to transcribe those. So it just helps me.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
You scan them, right, Kate? And I feel like there are apps that are helpful for this,
so.
But I also have like a more analog system like that, Molly, but I like the writing on the folder.
Yeah.
It seems to work, but it's a significant chunk of time.
Right. I do keep receipts that don't have to do with recipe testing in case anyone wanted to make sure that I wasn't just writing off all of my grocery bills.
Mm-hmm.
So I just do that, and I just have this envelope, and anytime I go to the grocery store, I just shove the receipts into that envelope until it gets too full. So then I have like a paper trail of times I've gone to the grocery store and haven't, deducted it as supplies.
Right.
I've never needed it, but I just do it as a peace of mind.
Yeah, because it does. I do worry sometimes that someone's going to come in and say, wait a minute, you bought some birthday candles on that grocery receipt.
But I think if you're blogging, doing stuff on social media, things that are income generating, those are also expenses.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to take that into consideration. And also sometimes like when you're reimbursed by someone who contracts you to do work, but then that reimbursement shows up on your 1099. And so you really do have to, expense that.
Right. And some employers do that and some don't. And so then you have to figure out, so then to go back and say, oh, well, I got reimbursed, but they put it on the,
Exactly.
It's making my head hurt.
It's headache.
I've actually heard that expenses for food writers that are often scrutinized the most are restaurant expenses. So, I mean, we don't even need to get into that, but it's a tricky thing. Like I actually don't write off many restaurant meals at all.
Nor do I.
I've heard that they are so scrutinized.
Yeah. Unless I'm traveling for work.
Exactly.
Right,
Yeah. Same.
So groceries can be sort of an overlooked expense for book creation, especially when you are doing a book that's more expensive to make, like something that has a lot of meat in it. But what are some of the other hidden costs? What about, say, hiring recipe testers? What other costs are there?
I've hired an editor.
And how much? What is the ballpark for an editor?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an hourly. It's just something where I've done just periodically. I just sent a few chapters off to someone and asked them to read them, to do light edits and things like that. And I'm not saying every cookbook author has to do that, and certainly doesn't, but it's something that you can do, and but you need to figure in the expense for it.
Right. And maybe that's a book coach or that kind of type of person. Where do you find, say, somebody who could give a developmental edit on a project?
If you have a book and you have a contract for a book, sometimes you can ask your publisher if they recommend anybody, or your agent, or Google.
Or Google.
Or even a friend.
Yeah.
That you trust who knows your subject, or an acquaintance, to see if they do that kind of work. Depending on how much it is, you may have to have 1099 towards tax time. So you need to collect their work. For example, I'm putting together this cool tote bag to merch my new book. And so there are expenses related to that, like artwork.
Yeah.
There's an illustrator that I'm working with. And so that's an expense that I, never anticipated. And I fit it into my budget and printing and shipping and all that stuff too. So you never know. And even if you're going to do research and travel, that's part of the expenses that you can write off. So it's not just groceries. There are all these like tiny little things that you want to think of because you are a sole proprietor.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And you have costs.
Yeah, I've done research trips for my books where I've traveled and spent time in kitchens or in libraries, and that's work. I'm doing it to figure out how to write a book. Yeah.
Or equipment. Sometimes you need to get a certain piece of equipment. For me, sometimes when I'm testing for other people and it calls for a specialty pan or something like that, that all gets written off if the client doesn't reimburse.
Yeah.
Right. And that's an equipment expense. And that's part of your toolbox, really. These are tools to help you do your job. And then you might hire outside marketing or that kind of thing when your book is out or PR. Like Andrea, you're just talking about just sort of like marketing PR sort of, ideas. But, when it comes to travel, how do you handle that?
Well, you mean travel for book promotion? Okay. So that's when you want to go back and lean a little bit on your publisher and see if there is a travel budget for promotion. And then how do you want to use that budget? And how do they want to use that budget? And you come together and detail a plan of sorts. And you're going to keep your receipts and max out that budget of theirs. So get that reimbursement in and then go from there in terms of figuring out what your own costs are associated with promoting the book out of the gate and maybe come up with a strategy for how to stretch those budget dollars because they don't have like a ton of money. And book publishers are not necessarily going to pull all the same levers for different titles, unfortunately.
True.
Yeah.
But you do want to make sure that your publisher believes in your project enough to like help you sell it. So they should pony up a couple of bucks here and there.
Yeah, I was going to say it is not always common for them to do that. Oftentimes what they'll do is if you want to go somewhere, then they'll help you coordinate a book event. So it could then make part of a vacation tax deductible. Talk to an accountant to make sure that's cool. But sometimes for me, in my case, I did not have a promotion. The publisher had a promotion budget. It wasn't used for me to travel. I'll say that.
Yeah. Well, those budgets aren't very big. So I'm oftentimes leaning on the goodness of friends.
Right. If you're willing to stay. I mean, I used to do more traveling and teaching. And so I would get teaching gigs and then tell the publisher, I've been hired to come here and teach some cooking classes. And then they would help me organize some events around that. But back to what Andrew was saying in the last episode about time, make sure, if you can, that you have time when the book comes out. I know I've made this mistake where I took on extra work because I was so, I spent all my advance because of my expensive recipe testing. And so I was ready to go back to work and earn some money. And then the book came out and I was not available for the marketing. And so that was a problem because that's a period of time where you want to spend some time marketing your book.
Yeah, I underestimated the amount of time. Thankfully, I had time in the end, but I was like, wow, this is a whole other job.
Yeah.
It is.
And if you're using your social media to promote your book, that takes a lot of time, and any expenses around that are part of marketing. So that's another column on your tax returns that this is marketing and self-promotion, and it's a business expense.
Definitely.
Thinking more about time, we're talking about marketing. One thing that comes up again and again, just thinking, Molly, about what you said about social media, something we also have to face as authors is this whole idea of the exposure economy. So who wants to maybe talk about that and when you figure out whether it's worth it or not? An exposure economy means basically, we'll do this for you if you do this for us for free or something like that. Sometimes these can be worthwhile, sometimes maybe not so much. Where do you figure out where to draw the line?
I think that the exposure economy is a situation where you oftentimes are willing to work for no compensation or low compensation in exchange for having the marketing exposure to someone else's audience. Sometimes, it's a situation where you're cross-promoting too. So they're getting access to your audience and you're getting access to their audience. And, financially, it can be worthwhile, especially I think if you're starting out, you're a little hungry, a little thirstier to get that level of exposure to people who don't already know you. you're looking to make new friends. It's like, hey, I'm going to go to that networking event, that they invited me to as the showcase star on the stage. And you do that. But there's a certain point where I think that you want to figure out, well, how much time does this really involve? The thing that people want to think about when they're marketing a book is that for cookbook authors, we can't just go to a book promotion event and like read our recipes aloud.
Right? Could you imagine? I would love it.
So
My
true.
husband keeps wanting me to. He's like, just open it up and say, combine those ingredients in a bowl. Heat it up over a medium-high flame. We can't do that. So when we do promotion, we are always kind of physically doing something with our hands. We're presenting food. Sometimes we're chasing people down in public to try to get them to taste something. It's a different ball game. And that when we're talking about the exposure economy, you have to think about, how much fun is that going to be for you? Is that worthwhile for you to do versus how many books are you going to sell? Sometimes you're not going to sell as many books, but you're going to do that event or that activity with a partner who can give you exposure to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who don't already know you. And I always ask people who approach me, like, how are you going to promote this event? And who's your audience? This is my audience, and I'm willing to co-promote with you. So what can we do together if it's going to be that sort of situation where it is definitely like I'm doing it for no money or low money?
Yeah, cooking classes are one of those things that can be amazing for promoting your book, but they're also a lot of work to do well.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they don't pay super well. Sometimes they pay nothing.
Well, and that goes back to opportunity cost, right?
Yeah.
If you have to spend a couple of days to get ready for this class and then you're not paid, and then maybe you sell a handful of books, but you're not sure if those sales are really going to get that book into the world where other people are going to see that book on the friend's coffee table and then buy it and all that, is the opportunity cost really worth it? I mean, I think sometimes we don't know.
Right.
Sometimes you want to, try the thing and see if it works.
And if you have a lot of fun doing it, then maybe, it was fun. But yeah, you need to factor in all those.
Right.
Yeah. And sometimes you just want to ask people very simply, is there a fee associated with this
Right.
proposal,
100%.
what you're proposing? Always ask.
What's your budget?
Yeah, what's your budget? Because, people don't think that you as a cookbook author are going to have to expend much energy to set up a cooking demo in your home and then do it on Zoom. They don't understand that
a lot of work.
takes planning, execution, and also cleanup, preparing materials and all that. Those are hours of time spent. And also you are gifting your intellectual property.
Yeah.
And that is valued at something.
So I think that's all things to factor in. I mean, how much of yourself do you need to give to this one event? I mean, it's different if you're showing up to do an interview and it's a 1 hour interview and you do the interview and maybe there's a write-up or there's a blog post that somebody else is doing. You're not writing the post and it goes out. It's like, oh, that was nice. But if you're spending 5 hours prepping for this thing, you do this 1 hour cooking demo, then afterwards, they don't even have a place for the audience to buy the book, that's probably a red flag.
Yeah. It's just so hard to know what is going to move the needle on your book sales. What is worth doing in terms of sell, because we're trying to sell the book. So, I mean, that's the end objective here. And it's just very hard to know which opportunities are worth creating or taking or saying yes to. And, we've talked to some authors who've just been, I don't want to do it. And it's like, I don't know. Sometimes maybe that doesn't matter either. It's hard to know. It's hard to know.
I think people who've listened to us for a long time might have heard us say, we need to get the book you get into a book in just a couple of people's hands and then you don't know it can grow. And it's every book talk that you get to, book talk, that's a different conversation. But any talk you give about your book could lend to another connection. Somebody else could find your book. We've said that in the past on our podcast. Do you think we're contradicting ourselves now by thinking, this is not worth it if we only sell one book?
No, I'm not saying it's not worth it. I'm just saying we have talked to some authors who just have been tired about it, not motivated to do it. So it's a tricky business, that marketing.
It really is.
But we're talking about the expense of it here, so we'll stick to that.
That's a good point. No, and just thinking about, going back to the time investment and some of the nitty gritty expenses, you might have travel expenses, you might have, grocery expenses for events and or testing your recipes. What other kinds of things do you factor into your budget when you're looking at that sort of, okay, I'm getting this little chunk of advance. I've got to stretch it for the next 6 months to cover my expenses for this book. What are we forgetting?
Here's something which we talked about photography on the previous episode. But there's a tricky situation that can happen where, let's say you get your advance one year, but your photography doesn't happen until the following year. And technically you should be taxed on it, right? That year you get the advance, but you need that money next year. Like, for that money to be taxed would actually really hurt you. There are ways to sort of like pre-write off an expense. And I did do that with my accountant. And it's something I tell a lot of people when they get their first book advance. So just something to keep in mind. I just thought of that.
Aligning the expense with the income.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very good point.
I don't know, Kate. There's just always something that I don't anticipate. So when you asked me, I was like, holy mackerel. I just like see all these things, you know.
Well, my laptop didn't keep up
tech.
because, I had an old ailing laptop and it wasn't up to the task. And so suddenly I was like, oh, I've got to get myself a new laptop.
Oh, yeah. I fried my laptop after deep frying in it 2 chapters. I don't play book.
Oh, gosh.
So that was an unanticipated expense.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a big one.
Well, and the research one, are you buying other books?
Sure.
I was just going to say that. I mean, sometimes things are not always directly tied to a book itself. It might just be to my overall work. But yes, books are a big expense for me. Magazines, other subscriptions, like memberships.
Memberships, most definitely. Professional memberships. I subscribe to a handful of different Substacks because I have a Substack and I want to find out what other people are doing and strategically and stuff like that. That's all tax writable, offable. That's an expense.
Yep.
So it sounds to me that what we're talking about today and in the previous episode we did is really planning for this sustainable career, thinking of yourself as a small business owner, because that's what you kind of set out to do. And even if you are employed, gainfully employed in another job, and you're doing this as a side gig, you still need to treat it with respect and seriousness that a business deserves. So in that sense, let's talk a little bit about like how we kind of keep this going. How do you keep making books and keeping it sustainable? We've talked a little bit about multiple income streams in earlier episodes, but what are certain things that can kind of dovetail nicely when you're working on a book, other kinds of income streams that can help you stay in book writing without making you go broke and thinking, I got to move in with grandma because I can't afford mortgage or rent or whatever. And guess what? That has happened to me. I don't know if I've ever told you guys this, and I'm almost embarrassed, not embarrassed, but I signed on to do 2 collaborations right when the economy sort of bottomed out in 2010. And I no longer had my full-time job at a restaurant magazine. And I had 2 book contracts. I didn't know how to juggle 2 book contracts at the same time. I was a co-author, so I didn't have, like, I wasn't getting all the advance. I was getting a percentage of the advance, and it was getting paid out in all these installments. I was in Chicago at the time. I moved in with my aunt and was able to not have to pay rent because I couldn't afford it, because I did not calculate the expenses that I needed to have on a monthly basis versus like what I would get in a year, because the income was so sporadic. So I feel kind of passionate about this because I really want to make sure people don't do what I did. I mean, it was kind of a shock losing the sort of stability of a full-time job and getting thrust into this freelance world without having done the homework ahead of time to know what I would need to know how to do. So that was everything from quarterly taxes, figuring out how to juggle receipts and figuring out like how I was going to pay bills on time. So these are things that, when it comes to like a sustainable career, I'm pretty passionate about it because I messed it up and almost had to just kind of abandon this whole experiment completely. So I feel like everyone here has done really smart things by being able to continue in making books. Any kind of tips for people who are sort of in a situation where maybe they have their first book deal and they're thinking, wow, this is great. What if I can just stop doing everything else and just work on this book? What would we tell them?
No. Unless you are that overnight sensation, TikTok wonder influencer that gets paid a lot of money to do sponsorships, but you also really have to make a really good book. So making a good book is not something you can phone in because it's in print. Making a good cookbook, you can't really phone in because you got to test the recipes and do all that proofreading and copy editing and promotion. And, we've talked about this. And I think that cookbook authors, we all have multiple income streams. Kate, I mean, like you work so much with food producers, right?
Right.
I mean, you do consulting in that regard. I've done corporate consulting. I freelance, right? I teach cooking classes. Molly, you teach cooking classes too.
And do consulting.
And Kristin, you teach writing.
Teach and I do copywriting. I had been freelancing for 10 years. And I was thinking, Kate, like I always made sure I had some kind of I always called it my anchor gig. So
Exactly.
like when I left a Food and Wine magazine, actually became my first client. And so they were like my anchor gig. And there was kind of this like guaranteed amount of income from them. And I was producing all kinds of content. And that went on for probably a year or so. And then I started finding other little pieces of anchor work where, it's guaranteed like 4 pieces a month for certain websites. Or sometimes the book project became an anchor gig, but then it was supplemented by these other things. So yeah, it's funny. And then more recently, I've been doing work with brands because I find it pays better. And I find it really fun. I actually see a lot of parallels with collaborating on cookbooks where you're trying to inhabit a voice and working with brands where you're trying to inhabit a voice. So yeah, my anchor gig now is copywriting. And then cookbooks have become more of my side thing.
Yeah. Kristin, I'm 100% on that advice at the anchor gig. And it's absolutely what I've always had and have anywhere from a half to a third of my income. I could count on that. And then that allowed me to sort of get the other, Kate, you said that thing about quarterly taxes. That was one of the big mistakes I made, is that I didn't know about that. I didn't know that if you don't have an employer, I mean, of course, withholding taxes from you are enough. And so you need to, estimate your taxes and pay them on a quarterly basis. But fortunately, if you can get away with it 1 year, just don't do it 2 years in a row. So
I was going to say, Andrea, for you with your website, like you have done such an amazing job of keeping a really active website. And I always think of that. I don't know if you think of that as your anchor gig, but in a way it is this like anchoring force, financial force in your life.
Some years it has been like tremendously, because the advertising on websites and folks who out there who have websites and have affiliate ads on them, you can do really, really well. And back in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was amazing because so many people cooked. And I was like floored by the amount of income that I drew that year from the website. However, as privacy laws are changing and also ad budgets are changing, the revenue earned from advertising on websites, it's not as good. It's going down.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. And everybody, I think even if you've got like a big corporate website as well.
Yeah.
So there are different models out there. Some people do sponsorships. I am not that good about that sort of thing, and people are like, send me your rate sheet. And I was like, what rate sheet? I need one. I don't know.
Because maybe that's a goal for 2023 after you get through book promotion.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, but it's also trying to figure out like what's going to work for who you are as a brand and what you want to do moving forward. So, I've brought up Substack before, and there are other authors who are now starting Substack newsletters, or they've had them, or they switched to Substack newsletters for their sole income. But it's a way to have an audience that is going to financially support your work. And you can have a great time and not worry so much about SEO and all that weird stuff.
Yeah, right. What do you want?
Yeah.
I'm actually just curious to hear what you all think of the idea of having a job that is not in food or not in writing, if that is an advantage to staying kind of excited about being in cookbooks and writing. Well, and Kristin, maybe I'll ask you this question because your copywriting, it's not always food. A lot of times it's not about food. Do you think that helps balance out your mind? There's like to keep the excitement in food, but while also doing something that you feel is kind of fun and completely different?
I can see it both ways. I mean, sometimes when everything's in food, it's a little easier to keep up on what's going on. You're just naturally reading certain things, and there can be this sense of falling out of touch with what's trendy. But then sometimes I've realized lately, I don't care that much. I don't care about trends that much. Like big trends, sure. But like the micro trends, the constantly changing trends, I don't know how much I care. Whether or not the topic, for me, it's more about like, how am I using my brain? Is it, really deep work, or is it kind of like fun and fast? Is it a lot of meetings? Like sometimes I have work where it's a lot of meetings. For me, the best balance is like if I can use my brain in different ways throughout the day, that's what's helpful rather than the topic itself.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I sometimes fantasize about work that's out of food, but
Oh, I do. But then it just keeps drawing me back.
yeah, but I like what you're saying, Kristin, too, though. It's like I'm thinking about the balance between developing recipes, writing, doing some teaching, planning events. There's a lot of different things and that use different parts of, editing somebody else's work is one of my favorite like side hustles, because that really, strengthens my own editing ability, but it just sharpens, keeps you sharp and keeps you thinking about it. Like, editing your own work is so hard, but when you can do somebody else's, it's like, oh yeah.
Oh, yeah. I love editing other people's work.
Me too. I would love to do more of that, because I feel like all of us, we need someone's fresh eyes to look at our work, but then we have so much to offer other people's work as well. But when you say sustainable career, I'm like, you may think that this is not sustainable from all the stuff that we've been talking about.
Good point. Good point.
Advances, royalties, marketing budgets, and all this. Like, no, why do we do this? But the thing is that when you are a cookbook writer, and even if you're a photographer, or stylist, whatever that you're doing in this particular field, there are so many things that you can do and be creative about and make money from. And you have to be willing to kind of be nimble about it. I mean, Kristin, you're like so entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a constant experimenter. I do love testing out different ways of earning money, helping people.
Sometimes I joke, I'm going to get a food and get a 9-to-5, but I never. No, I'd rather juggle all this stuff and make my mistakes and have lean years and years that aren't so lean, but to piece it all together like one big puzzle, it's exciting.
And it's also something you're building yourself that you can really take pride in. That's a really great way to conclude this episode. This is one great big puzzle that you're building as you go, and you can make it as big or as small or as wild as you want it to be. So I think this episode gives all our listeners a little bit of a peek behind the crazy financial curtain that is cookbook publishing. And any questions you all have, send us an email on everythingcookbooks.com, and maybe if we get enough questions, we can do a Q&A episode in the future. So with that, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to connect, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcast or wherever you get your audio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks as always to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on reading, writing, and cooking.